I have to say, when I was asked to moderate this session, and it's because it's on code and AI, I decided to put the question to ChatGPT on both the books. And if you'll just indulge me, I'd like to read out how a machine sees your book, or, reveals itself. Code-Dependent, Pros and Cons of the Algorithmic Age is an insightful book by Anjana Menon that examines the profound influence algorithms have on modern life. This book delves into how algorithms are increasingly driving decisions in various sectors, including social media, healthcare, finance, and law enforcement. Ahuja provides a balanced perspective, highlighting both the advantages and potential drawbacks of our reliance on algorithms. Tom, you've done a lot better than that.
Has it got his name right?
Oh, no, we'll just get to that.
In which case he wins.
Wise Animals, A Guide to Animal Intelligence, is a fascinating exploration of the cognitive abilities of various animal species. Written by animal behaviorist and researcher Radhika Natarajan. Sorry about the gender. The book dives into the surprising and often underestimated world of animal intelligence. Natarajan's engaging writing brings to life the stories of animals displaying remarkable problem-solving skills, emotional depth, and social complexity. So, this is really the context of both the books, because I think most of us think of AI as this great thing that's going to transform our lives. It's going to give us all the right answers. And we don't really get to see the other side of AI and how wonderfully the predictive text can hallucinate and make things up, and how it hates to fail. But let's start with probably a reading of the book, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I promise to be brief, and my book is not about that stuff at all. You may be disappointed. It's a much better book. It's the trouble. When I wrote this book, I was, I think, just slightly obsessed with the idea that everyone's very miserable about technology for very good reasons at the moment. But I guess I wanted to try and salvage a sort of reality-based optimism. I may or may not have succeeded in that, but it felt very important to me to try and tell the story of our co-evolution with technology, to emphasize the fact that we have immemorially extended ourselves through technology, through a human-made world, that what's going on now, although of course it's novel in many ways, is also incredibly precedented. And we desperately need to bring to bear upon the present moment the tools of philosophy, of literature, of aesthetics, of psychology, of personal feeling. We can't let a bunch of technologists talk about the future on all our behalves in a language denuded of depth and complexity and resonance and so on. So I'll just read a tiny bit from the start of the book. In his 1999 essay, How to Stop Worrying and Learn to Love the Internet, the British author Douglas Adams said this about technology. Technology is stuff that doesn't work yet. We no longer think of chairs as technology, we just think of them as chairs. But there was a time when we hadn't worked out how many legs chairs should have, or how tall they should be, and they would often crash when we tried to use them. Before long, computers will be as trivial and plentiful as chairs, and we will cease to be aware of the things. Now, Adams was both being amusing and making a serious point. The world we're born into is underpinned by millennia of innovation and ingenuity, most of which long ago sank beneath the surface of human attention. So we call technology the shiny, strange, new stuff, the gadgets we can't wait to get our hands on as teenagers, only to fret over their mind-warping powers once we become parents. Like me, I should add. I spend a lot of time fretting over my children's minds being warped. So should we all take a deep breath, reread the title of Adams's essay, and just accept that this is how things are? Well, despite being a lifelong fan of Adams's writing, My answer is no. In fact, I think it's important for us to head in the opposite direction. It's not that the world needs more hand-wringing over smartphones, or the kind of nostalgia that forgets how much suffering our ancestors endured on the way to becoming us. Rather, I think we need the right kind of worries. And this means turning our gaze away from gadgets towards the values and assumptions baked into them, not to mention the structures, incentives, and understandings surrounding their creation. That's me.
So actually moving from the sort of broad sweep of the context of what we're speaking about to the tiny, intimate moments, the people involved. So I'm going to read from my first chapter, which tries to peel back the magic of AI, the curtain, and look behind it at who is really there powering this revolution. As you drive down Mombasa Road, you trace the curves of Nairobi National Park, a wild oasis which makes Nairobi one of the only urban centers where you can spot giraffes alongside tall buildings while speeding down the expressway. Sama's primary facility is on this floor, on this road, 4 floors of a building in a large commercial business park housing more than 2,800 people. Outside, a towering sign announces Sama with its tagline, "The soul of AI." This building is all polished concrete floors and walls accented with corrugated iron. It is furnished in reclaimed wood and tin with colorful hanging works of local art and potted plants. I'm told it's supposed to be reminiscent of the workers' homes in the informal settlements they come from. The designer who consulted with early employees wanted to use these familiar materials so that employees would think of the space as beautiful and also as theirs. Sama's building is aesthetic, but ultimately it's an office. Banks of agents, the name Sama gives to its workers, sit at computers, clicking and tracing shapes around images of all kinds. Room after room is filled with 20-somethings, young women and men, clicking, drawing, tapping. It requires precision and focus, but is repetitive, a game of shape sorting, word labeling, and button clicking. For human beings, these tasks are largely easy, obvious even, although for AI systems, they are novel and complex. The agents confer sometimes, but mostly focus on their own screens, a few seconds per image and on to the next. Hip-hop streams out of one corner. The mouse clicks drum along with the beats. A team of agents is tagging cars driving on streets in China and Japan. Others are tagging close-ups of maize plants, satellite imagery of European towns, logging trucks lifting wood and women's clothing. Click, draw, tap. An average work shift here starts around 7 o'clock in the morning, lasting 8 hours. Workers join Sama mostly from informal jobs, like domestic cleaning or selling chapatis on the street. Because of how the AI supply chain is broken down into bite-sized chunks, many of these workers have little, if any, visibility of the shape or commercial value of the final product they are helping to build. But they do know they're helping train software for some of the most advanced technological applications in navigation, social media, e-commerce, and augmented reality. I'll stop that for now.
So my first question's to you, Tom, and it's kind of a broad question because it's an argument you've made in the book, where we're constantly told that technology is neutral, and you're saying, well, it's anything but neutral. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. So in the book, as a way of trying to suggest richer ways of thinking about technology than is commonly done in everyday discussions, I particularly focus on what I call the delusion of neutrality. And it's very simple. I'm sure you will have heard the line, technology is neutral. It's just how you use it that matters. And I think this is wrong and silly and dangerous. It's understandable if you're a technology company, because then, just as guns don't kill people, all you have to do is try and sort of make a good tool in your own terms, and then maybe fund an education and awareness program. But if we think about any technology at all, any aspect of the human-made world, from the phone in my pocket to the building we are sitting in, everything we create has certain affordances, to borrow a word from really evolutionary biology. And an affordance is very simple. It's what something offers. It's what it facilitates. Winston Churchill famously said of the House of Commons, we shape our buildings and thereafter our buildings shape us. The media theorist Marshall McLuhan adapted this line in his own work. Self-evidently, if I want to kill you, a gun is better than a pencil, even if I am a ninja. If I am navigating the world on my phone through a proprietary service like Google, then that is weighted towards certain kinds of interaction. It's weighted towards the kind of things in a town like London, in a city, that you can find on your phone when I type in cafes. There's algorithms sitting between me and the places I go. They don't include things such as beauty, except incidentally. They don't represent the world in the same way as a two-dimensional map. They're better in some ways and worse than others. It's very different to encounter the world through a smartphone than through a conversation. It's very different to consume a website than consume a book. Neither is necessarily better than the other in a straightforward ethical sense of this is bad and this is good, but each one has values and assumptions baked into it. And I guess the case I'm trying to make, just as we were hearing here, is that we have to think very carefully indeed about what is baked into very complicated technologies with global supply chains, with unacknowledged and unseen labor, with data that isn't neutral, drawn from certain places, certain languages, certain geographies. There are assumptions everywhere we look. And that means that the great prize for me is together to try to be critically discerning consumers, critically discerning users of technology, to be able to say no as well as yes to its offerings, to conduct an informed negotiation with this value-laden human-made world we'll live in.
Madhumita, when I read your book, it's full of rich stories of people, and at one point I thought, well, the title of the book should be Human Dependent. But what is the single most troubling discovery that you made about AI and the systems while researching and writing the book?
So the reason it's called code dependent is it's actually an interesting angle on exactly what Tom was talking about, which is how we shape one another, right? It's the codependency of the technologies. And for me to bring that to life, I felt the only way I knew how was to find stories of real ordinary people, not the creators of the technology that we elevate and deify and kind of obsess over, but ordinary people who haven't really thought about what the technology might do to them, but whose lives have been changed and who respond accordingly. So that was kind of my motivation. But I would say I went into it very agnostic. I'm not somebody who I'm not pessimistic as a person, but even in terms of my attitude to technology, I trained previously as a scientist, and I believe in the promise of new science, of scientific development and innovation and what technology can do to better us. And over the last 10 years that I've reported on AI, I have found increasingly that the story has become darker. It started off as this maverick, endeavor to change the world and solve problems, but here we are today, where it's embedded into these consequential parts of our lives, everything from criminal justice to healthcare to, the things that ChatGPT listed, although not all are in my book. But, genuinely changing these, life-changing, like health for example. And so for me, it was about finding those examples and bringing them to life. And so I went in kind of thinking I'll look for both good and bad. But through the reporting of this book, I think what was revealed to me was the sort of dark underbelly of AI in action. And, I would say it started to sort of come to light very slowly rather than a moment of shock. But what I found is at the end of it was I had written quite a dark book without actually setting out to do so, which really looks at how AI is impacting people today. And more often than not, there were failures and there were harms. And I think for me, maybe the most shocking part of it is how little the builders of the technology and those who implement it know about how it works. There is so little understanding and so much opacity around the workings of the technology, which leads to the harms in action. So one of the stories I focus on is a single mother in Amsterdam whose 2 sons are put on a list compiled by the Amsterdam mayor's office that say that these boys, these children, will go on to commit crimes in the future. So basically Minority Report come to life. This program is still ongoing in Amsterdam. And I spent time with Diana, the mother in this, to really understand how it impacted her and her relationship with her children. And what I found was just this, a huge lack of empathy in even including the people who you're targeting. So set aside whether the system even works to begin with, whether it's biased. 90% of the children on this list were male and came from North Africa. They were immigrants, even though the technology, the algorithm was supposed to be race blind and gender blind. So even setting aside, the most important question of whether it even works was this callousness of, excluding mothers, excluding families and the boys themselves, and sort of instead putting this target on their backs, this punitive scarlet letter that said they would go on to commit crimes in some cases when they had never ever committed a crime before. And one of her boys was 14. So I think for me was the most shocking, that we have already implemented systems into criminal justice, into diagnosing diseases, into giving out public services, all without knowing whether they work and actually even how these systems work at all.
Tom, one of the things that's not discussed enough is the colonization of, data, using armies of people who are sitting there and providing the data to you. How do you resist that colonization? And especially in the context that, we're almost in love with the colonizers. We love the tech czars. We want to, we can't wait to hear what they're going to say after they've had their little jolly spliff. So,
I think I felt one of the points that came through very clearly to me when reading Madhumita's book was precisely the fact that there's no such thing as data, and there's no such thing as AI in the general and the abstract. There isn't just data that's out there in a kind of ocean that you go down into and trawl some up. There are specific systems developed by specific corporations for specific purposes in specific ways, trained on particular data, and that data, that word data, actually means details about people's lives and world and history and language. There's nothing abstract and shiny about all this. And for me, one of the most important things is getting specific. Any meaningful ethics of technology, I think, has to be rooted in a specific account of a system in the world. So we're not trying, a lot of technologists like the idea of alignment as a sort of magical hand-waving gesture. An alignment means taking an AI that may or may not be super powerful and then orientating it with human good and possibly the future of our species in magical happy land. And this is, you could say it's a lovely idea, but it's both a fairy tale and it's a distraction from the fact that AI systems are bunkers full of computers trained on details about people's lives and the world. So, I believe, difficult as it may be, that what you need to do is surface this stuff, is cast light on the shadow. In particular, when you look at people who are trying to regulate and make AI systems accountable, they tend to do kind of model cards. They tend to look at who is the system going to affect and how. What are its outputs? What is it doing? Are the things that it's doing fair, reasonable, compatible with certain societal freedoms? Freedom to go about your life without discrimination, privacy, and so on. And I think these specifics are where we need to focus, this insistence that there's not some abstract code-driven process, that there's what a system does, and there's holding those profiting from and maintaining the system accountable. And that involves, to be honest, looking at the people it affects, how it affects them, talking to them, listening to them, and building mechanisms of oversight and redress and scrutiny into the society, into the environment within which the AI exists. So we need to flee abstraction at all costs.
You know, just to follow up on that, but as an individual level, what can people do? Because you sort of feel the convenience has taken over my life.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, you know, the primary reason we're in this position is because of the position of power occupied by technologists today. Not just obviously the fact that you know, many of them are now trillion-dollar corporations that are larger than many countries, and that they have billions of users and so on, but also how much you know, weight their words hold in conversations, you know, in whether that's at the highest levels with government or, you know, with hospitals and so on. You know, they are the loudest voices in the room. And partly it's because the rest of us have begun to feel like we don't understand anymore as the technology has evolved to become more complex, and it's titled words, you know, we call it artificial intelligence, you know, we talk about machines reasoning. It feels like if you're not a technologist, you can't have a say, you can't have a voice, and you don't understand. That is the first thing that needs to change, because if you have an AI system coming into your kid's school, you know, I know my cousins live in California, and their children have now an AI chatbot tutor that they kind of work alongside.
I hope it's better than the one that gave me the responses today.
Well, let's hope, and we don't know. That's the thing. But you know, the person on the other end of that is an 8-year-old girl, and so you know, this is the thing. It's now entering spaces where you have people with other types of expertise. You know, hospitals, schools, governments. There are people who can have a say even if they don't understand how the technology works. And this is the big criticism of regulators. How could they possibly regulate a technology that if they don't even understand what model cards are, or if they don't understand what RLHF is, etc. They don't need to know all of the details in order to do it. They have regulated areas that are complex in the past and other types of technology. So I think it's about having more participation from all of us with our own perspectives and our own expertise. As parents, as employees in an organization that might have AI recruitment systems, and asking the questions, which A is, does this work? How do you know that it works? If you don't know it works, then why are we using it, right? So this feels pretty fundamental to me. And if we are going to have them diagnosing breast cancer, or you know, deciding if someone should get bail, then they have to be audited and evaluated for bias. So do they make the same mistakes over and over again? And if yes, who do they affect, and how do we fix that? And that comes down to accountability. Who is the human in charge? Who's holding the pen at the end of the day? I write 9 stories across my book, mainly focused on sort of 12 people. In every case, you know, the harms that crop up are because of that lack of human being accountable at the end of the day, and nobody asking these questions of, you know, how were people compensated when it was built? How does it work? And how do we know when it goes wrong? So I think we can break it down pretty simply.
So, you know, but I do have a follow-up question to that. I mean, when you read the book, you sort of begin to understand that AI is neither democratic nor benign. But there are these armies of people who are working on it. So it's a scientist who's worked on something, and he doesn't really know what the end use case will be. How much of this do you think is kind of this opacity, so to speak, is built in and deliberate, and how much of it is just inadvertent because you're working on something, you're a passionate scientist, but you really don't know what the use case is maybe 4 years down the line? I mean, a bit like Tom's example of the wheel. It started as a plaything for a child, and now, you know, further on down civilization, it's got other uses.
Yeah, I'll pass to you in a second. But just to say, I think there's a huge, the problem with only having technologists in the conversation is it limits our imagination as a society. Why can, Carl Rissenek is the facial recognition researcher you're referring to. Why could he not think about the potential use cases? Why was it not obvious to him after 20 years of working on it that this would be used by police to surveil and, to wield against people from his own community? If he had thought about that aspect of his work, I think he could have arrived there pretty quickly. The problem is that he wasn't encouraged to, and he didn't think it was his problem. And this is why when you have philosophers in a room or creative writers, they can actually inject some imagination into the conversation and say, oh, I wonder how a technology that can recognize any person on the street might be used. I guess, here are like 20 ways. And that's kind of what science fiction writers do, right? That's the whole, that's what it looks like. And so I think that, that people should be imagining these futures.
Tom, I have a slightly nuanced question to this. How do you choose whether you should participate in it or not? Because sometimes it could just be you need the job, you've been asked to, code and build something, and you're not your economic compulsion is far greater than the moral compulsion of that.
Yes, and I think there's an old saying from William Gibson, the future's already here, it's distributed unevenly. And of course, the same is true of power and knowledge. Some people have more agency than others. And I think it's very tempting to blame people to say, and actually, to some degree, I think people are accountable to the degree that they should have known or could have known. But again, governance structures people in rooms. It's harder to do the wrong thing if the room that you're in has more people in it. It's easier to do wrong things if the organization you're in is aligned with profit and the exploitation of data at all costs. I think that the thing I come back to is the fact that AI doesn't want anything. Technology doesn't, it has affordances, it facilitates certain things, but it doesn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to make loads of people redundant. That's what I'm going to do. A company does that. And if a police force has to apply, has to decide it wants to deploy facial recognition, it has to seek permission to do that. We see pushback against that. Every decision to deploy AI in a certain way begs precisely these questions. Well, what are going to be the consequences of this? Will it work? What will its unintended consequences be? And I think we need to normalize at every stage of the process just a richer kind of scrutiny, which to be honest is very pragmatic. It can be justified not only in ethical terms, but also in terms of cost benefit, in terms of wider social impact. Shall we introduce something that will entirely hollow out the creative sector and the next generation of artists, writers, creators, and television producers, an industry that generates more than 100 billion a year in the UK alone? Maybe we should think twice about some of that stuff. Should we put into the marketplace goods and products where people have no idea whether a human created them, an AI created them, or some kind of hybrid? Again, maybe that's not a very functional marketplace. Should we have marketplaces online which can absolutely drown in AI-generated spam and nonsense and dropship rubbish and so on and so on? And so I think at every stage here, there's a decision where you can try to ask people some pretty basic questions and insist that there is an obligation to consider, so far as possible, consequences, the balance of risks, unintended consequences and effects. Part of the problem is just that there is either ignorance or silence in an overwhelming number of these situations. We are wise belatedly, and we can't just click our fingers and correct this. But I think a really practical first start is exactly the discipline of not being fobbed off by we're introducing an efficient new system that will optimize this, thank you very much, bye. What's it going to do to me, to my child, to this service? What's it doing? How do you know it works? And insofar as law, voting, governance can allow for accountability, these questions need to be asked, and anyone asking them deserves an answer in language that they can understand and not to be patronized or fobbed off?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, the thing that comes to mind is the lovely AI line, AI and robotics will take away the dull, dirty, and the dangerous jobs, so you must have a lot of it. But Madhumita, in your book, there was this really riveting chapter on healthcare and how this young doctor who's struggling, and she doesn't have enough resources. She's running a small hospital in a tribal belt, which is an underserved area, where she finds that she can get a little bit of assistance using an AI tool, and that helps her better with the diagnosis. Now, that's the good side of the story, and that's why she's willing to share patient information with, a corporation. But do you want to talk a little bit about what the other side was?
Sure. I will say that for me, that most of my optimism that remains about AI comes from how it can impact, particularly in healthcare and in scientific research more broadly. And so when I was looking at healthcare, I went looking for a good example of a doctor who could embody what we respect about human doctors, about having a human there, and contrast that to the advantages of an AI system that might be accurate more often, and to then kind of consider the question of, would we still want a human if you know that there are AI systems available that are basically as good or better than some human doctors. And so I met Ashita Singh, who is based in a tiny village on the border of Maharashtra and Gujarat, and who helped to train and test a tuberculosis diagnostic app. And actually, in her case, she was the only basically a diagnostic specialist there, and she sort of saw it, she said, as a second opinion, as a friend, and it really helped during COVID when they were really struggling there, and they had thousands of deaths in a tiny hospital because it could differentiate between COVID and other diseases. But for her, the sort of magic of the tool was getting it to places where there were no doctors at all, and of which there were hundreds of thousands of people, even in her own area, who had no healthcare access and who could at least be filtered through the system. And so I was really, really heartened by this, and I think I remain. I can see how this is going to be life-changing here in the UK, where the NHS is struggling, crumbling, and we have a huge shortage of radiologists, and you can see how people can genuinely, our lives can be saved by technologies like this. I guess the flip side, which I discussed a bit with Ashita, on one hand, there's the question of who owns the data. And again, when we talk about data, it's very easy to dehumanize, but data is people. And in this case, it's patients and their illnesses and their bodies, and sharing that with, as you say, companies. In this case, it was an Indian startup, but it's had funding from major Western venture capital funds. And you have corporations like Google also doing healthcare work in India, collecting data from the front lines via ASHA workers, who are the sort of frontline community health workers, and then using that data to build systems that are then used in other parts of the world. You can, of course, see how this might be lucrative for a company like Google. And so then the question is it ever going to get to the people who really need it? Or are they simply going to be the guinea pigs, the data collection, sources? And ultimately, are they if they can't pay for human healthcare, why would they be able to pay for AI healthcare? And what are we doing about that? And I think that remains an open question. She still hasn't managed to get, this system to be funded by the government to actually reach places without hospitals. And so I think, but if we can get over that, and particularly I think this is the role that governments have to play about, what are our incentives? Where do we want to focus AI, and who do we want to have access? If we can do that, this can save lives.
So, Tom, here's a great benign example. And if you are a young doctor who's, practicing in a tribal belt, you don't have enough resources, it's going to be very difficult for you to ask all those questions about AI. How do you then tackle it when you are in that vulnerable position and your purpose really is to do good?
Yeah, so I think I don't want to be too doomy. I think there can be enormous benefits to, and that's, trying to replace the word AI again with more specific descriptions sometimes, to very smart, automated systems that can identify patterns in huge amounts of data at speed, that can codify expert knowledge. In terms of access, in terms of languages, in terms of people with disabilities who are non-neurotypical, in terms of democratizing access to information and understanding that there's huge power here. If we look at medicine, in many ways we have a very good paradigm. In the UK and elsewhere, we have bodies like NICE, like the NIHR journals and so on, evaluating research, assessing the benefits of treatments and providing practical, up-to-date guidance to physicians as to best practices. Now, we can and should include AI assistants, cognitive models, co-pilots, and diagnostic models in there. We already have plenty of scoring models in medicine which are enormously good at coming up with noise-free diagnoses of things like coma scales, of things like severities of cancer. We already see AI assistance with diagnostic procedures. Cardiologically, again, ECGs are very susceptible to automated analysis. But I think here we see that having an expert assessing body, doing evidence-based assessments, providing recommendations to physicians is enormously empowering, because then, just like this doctor in the field would not want to prescribe an expensive drug that does no good, just because a drugs company wants you to, they would not want to use an AI diagnostic assistant that was discriminatory in some dangerous way. In the book, Madhumita uses the example of data accidentally misdiagnosing because children were included in scan data, and so it became very adept at spotting children rather than spotting differential diagnoses. And so again, I think governments, third-party bodies have really an ethical duty to help us unlock the huge potentials of AI by taking a close interest in the certification and assurance that they do what is claimed, that they have been checked, that they're subject to the same kind of tests as drug or treatment regimens, that they have oversight, and that then professionals and citizens can go and use them with confidence, and probably also that the data, that the value being generated by the deployment in the world is not all being captured for the opaque benefit of shareholders. That's very important. The place we're sitting in right now is, among other things, a repository of cultural data and information that is held in trust for the nation. And just as with health, it would be a great shame, I think, if all the value latent in that was ultimately extracted for private profit rather than structurally put at the service of citizens.
I hate to break this to you, but as we speak, some data machine is trawling through each and every book that will be then repurposed and given back to you. But, Madhumita, one of the things that struck me in the book, in fact, it's quite frightening, if I may use the word, was deep fakes. And, the examples that you had, it's individuals who led the fight, who said, well, you can't exploit my face and you can't use this. Why is it that governments are not acting with the kind of speed and intent that we want them to?
So, so in that chapter, I look particularly at deepfake pornography, and I focus on two women, ordinary women, a poet in the UK and an Indian student in Sydney who find these awful images and videos of themselves online. And I think the worst discovery for them and for readers is there's nothing they can do about it because it's legal, right? If they went to the police, they were told, well, this is legal, there's nothing they can do. So it's that sense of having no agency in being able to, solve something that is so deeply dehumanizing, which I think is actually a kind of a marker of AI technologies that I found through the reporting I did, this kind of impact on the individual's agency. But as you say, when it comes to the fight back, it's individuals again, whether on their own or banding together. And for me, that was one of the sort of most surprisingly hopeful discoveries along the way, that in some ways the opaque nature of the system and the sort of computer says no, locking us out, was strengthening collective agency, was actually forcing people to band together. And you can see this really clearly with gig workers as well. It started off with Uber and Lyft and Swiggy and all of these on-demand companies saying you work for yourself, you're just an individual. But actually them discovering over time that they're being controlled by algorithmic systems and they have no rights. And where we are today is that you have unions all over the world. I went to Argentina, to Kenya, even in China, where these things aren't legal, but people are banding together, unionizing, and finding a way to fight back and push for regulations. So I think in terms of, why aren't governments doing, I think they are taking notice of it now that, in the US, the White House has already started to figure out, through its executive order, how it's going to shape these systems. The UK is probably the most behind when it comes to this, but is actively examining how they would want to move forward. China already has regulations in place. But I think that will be pushed forward by people banding together and demanding, right? And this is why the final kind of third of my book focuses on activists who are spurring others on through their example to come together and push and lobby for change. Because on the other side, you have tech companies who are spending millions on lobbyists who have had loud voices in the shaping of the EU AI Act, for example. And we're seeing those lobbying teams being beefed up. So we do need to have a counterweight to that, and that is going to come through people.
Tom, one of the things about the internet age and now the AI age is that misinformation is beautifully packaged and sold to us. And it's more or less the norm, not the exception. How do you put a pause button on something like that?
One of the great troubles, I think, with misinformation is always that one person's misinformation is another person's identity. And I think, if you look at the research into this, again and again you come up with the very old and familiar fact that people think in stories, and that to some degree, when people believe or have allegiance to something or not, it's the story that commands their assent. And I do think it can be very dangerous to legislate for truth. It can backfire. It can be co-opted by those who want to have a monopoly on truth. Now, I guess there are traditional answers to this around education and so on. I mean, I don't think there are any easy answers. I think it's good to remember that what we call misinformation or disinformation is something very ancient. It's rumor, it's tribal allegiance, it's the existence of kind of multiple versions of reality. But I do think that, for me, the most helpful models are, if you like, ecological or epidemiological. And what I mean by that is they're about the health of a system as a whole. The health of the system where information is shared, discussed, debated, understood. On the one hand, you don't want there to be incredibly strong incentives to just share information because it's emotionally engaging, and zero penalties for it being defamatory, wildly inaccurate, and so on. The idea of a social media network on which the sole criterion for rewarding an interaction is its emotional impact is a recipe for certain kinds of discussion, as we all know. But you can't go and change human nature. So I think we see again and again that when people are developing an allegiance for misinformation or what we call conspiracy theories, or it's bound up with societal discontent, with inequality, with a sense of alienation. It's not just bad information causing people to be bad. It's often people who feel betrayed by governments and leaders who don't feel they have chances in the world, finding narratives that express their disaffection and rage. People say, I can't believe anyone could vote for Trump, say. It's incredibly easy to believe. If you believe that the government holds you in contempt, then a candidate who's all about burning it to the ground is your ideal person. If you believe that you're being lied to and patronized by the medical establishment, then someone who says that pharmaceutical companies are lying is going to command your attention. So although it's not an easy answer, I think that actually we do ourselves a disservice by trying to sort of force people to face facts and legislate for information. I think we need to look at the joined up system through which people understand themselves. Because given in the right conditions, the crowd can be very wise indeed. People can be very discerning. But when they feel they're not being listened to, when they feel betrayed, then they will find a way to reach out to leaders and narratives that give voice to their discontent and alienation and fear.
The vote. I'm told we've only got 15 minutes left, so we should open this to the audience if anyone has any questions. The lady at the far.
Thank you so much for speaking about such an interesting subject, and really interested in hearing your opinion on the AI Safety Summit. You know, a number of major tech companies obviously joined forces, like Anthropic, DeepMind, and everyone joined the AI Safety Summit. But is it just lip service?
So I was in Bletchley Park last November when that happened, and since then there's been another edition of the summit in Seoul in South Korea. You'll see there was a big difference in terms of hype between those two, and also in terms of attendance from the major companies. In fact, I don't think any of those CEOs who were there previously went back 6 months later, which I think tells you something. You know, when it was convened in November, I do think it was a moment to bring, you know, all of these voices together in one room and to kind of bring attention to the subject. But it's unclear to me what is going to come out of that. And it's unclear that whatever, you know, agreements were signed there, that anybody is holding, and, you know, people to account. One of the things I do think has worked well is the AI Safety Institutes that came out of it. So we now have, there's one in the UK, you know, led by Ian Hogarth and others, and now one in the US also, which has recently been announced. And that's a much more research-led way of doing this, rather than platitudes and agreements, which is all self-governed, right? It's actually hiring independent researchers to be the third parties who check these systems, who try to evaluate them, and then who ensure that the companies aren't releasing these systems before they're happy with it. And for me, you know, coming from a scientific background, it feels like a much more robust way of doing the thing than talking about it over days. So I think that we will see good things coming out of the Institute.
I'll be very brief. I'd second the praise for the AI Safety Institutes. You know, research-led approach is important when even the companies in questions don't necessarily know what's going to happen next, or what's going on, or how their models will be used. With the summit, I think, as ever, one of the interesting things was who wasn't in the room. And one of the answers is representatives of civil society, of education, of health, of, you know, quote unquote, ordinary people, community leaders, and so on. Obviously, you can't invite everybody in the world, but I think I would have been a lot more comfortable with the debates if there had been people in the room with the chief executives who are running health trusts and schools and not-for-profits, and who are on the front line of all the marvelous stuff that AI is allegedly transforming. I don't want to be a doomer, because the technologies, the hype is deserved, it's a big deal. It's about how we transform ourselves as a species and our understanding of our world. But my goodness, we need to bring a far richer and more broad and empathetic understanding of what's at stake into these rooms.
The gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Wonderful insights from all of you, and it shows how it is the civic responsibility of all of us to inform ourselves better about this, and to insist on more civil society involvement in these areas. I'm wondering, with respect to many aspects of AI and other technological platforms which have effectively kind of established a sort of monopoly on how we do business or how we talk, for example, Google, Instagram, X, and so on. You've talked about the importance of the state assuming some responsibility for regulating these. To what extent has it already become the case, and to what extent is it quickly becoming even further the case, that the state will no longer be able to regulate, particularly individual nation states won't be able to regulate these private companies that are effectively running public spaces?
I can jump in quickly to say that there's no reason why states shouldn't. That is the role of governments. Governments have different incentives and responsibilities to private corporations whose responsibilities are to shareholders or to maximizing profit. And so they, yes, the companies are powerful, they lobby, but ultimately, if the US government comes out and says you can't, Google can't launch a system into schools when we know that it's coming out with lies and made up facts and hallucinating, deeply disturbing facts, then they can't do it. So, I guess the thing is, like, we've spent years being afraid to curb the power of large tech companies because of the sort of reach and impact that they've had on the average person. And we did that with social media. We kind of missed the boat when it came to that. And I see no reason why you can't have clear rules. I mean, we're in this debate now. You can see in California, they're trying to draft a bill, and there's strident criticism of it, saying how dare they try and curtail us when all we're doing is trying to innovate. And we have to, governments have to figure out where the line is and draw it. And of course they still have the power to do that. That's what they're for. So that they shouldn't be afraid to.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's one of the big questions. Like some people here, I'm old enough to remember when the internet was inevitably going to cause democracy to flourish across Asia and the Middle East and Russia, and when governments could do nothing to resist the pure torrents of digital freedom wafting through internet protocol. And, you go to China or Iran or Russia today and try and waft freedom through the internet, and the government will take a pretty close interest in you. Governments have huge amounts of power. They just sometimes don't like to use it or don't feel they can. They choose not to, but the idea that governments don't have power is ludicrous. They have a legal monopoly on violence, among other things, which is quite powerful. We forget that at our peril. There's plenty of legal violence in the world. You can bash down doors. Now, I'm not saying they should, but I think the get-out clause, governments, of course, may worry about driving investment away and being left behind. They may worry about voters. They may worry about all of these things quite rightly, but they have the power. And the EU's AI Act is, though flawed, a very ambitious attempt to define the terms under which you need to adhere to these if you want to operate in the EU, the world's wealthiest trading bloc. It'll be interesting to see what happens and how enforceable it is, but you can't let governments off the hook.
Gentleman in front.
That was a very, very interesting session. So a comment and a question, Tom, from what you said about AI and questioning its impact. I think that's applicable for any technology, time and moment. In fact, what you said, it reminded me of what was, in the recent past, a very, very big scandal on the post office. The impact of technology on ordinary lives having not been understood and what it can lead to, right? Which is a big issue here. But then, most of the conversation I heard today was on AI, which I think has been around for the last 10, 15 years, but I think more pertinently, Gen AI and its impact on this. Now, given that we are in a literary festival and all of you are authors and there's an element of how the creative industry is going to be impacted, I think what I've read is that AI will not take away your job as long as you're using AI, right? So how do you see the future for your profession as authors, as writers, with the advent of Gen AI? How do you see that changing?
So I'm both a journalist and an author, so like double jeopardy here. The internet almost destroyed newspapers a while ago, and we're still seeing the impacts of that disintermediation, right? Of the fact that all the pipes, the distribution channels now belong to tech companies, and newspapers and magazines are dependent on these channels to reach readers. And there has been a decimation of sort of local news. And we're still seeing examples of that. Huge institutions like the LA Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal have all had redundancies extremely recently. I think, so on the one hand, I think that there is an existential question for the news industry, because it's very easy to see how generative AI can become a news source. And it's doing that simply by appropriating the work that my colleagues and I have done, right? Because now there are deals being made with news organizations, but really up to that point, all of this work was scraped for free and then built into a Q&A system that you can go and ask. And most recently, yesterday, I saw Perplexity, which is one of the kind of hot new AI startups. It's kind of an AI search engine. It's a really good, useful tool. But Fortune magazine had a scoop about Eric Schmidt, I think, funding a drone company. So they had this news story, which Perplexity had essentially just taken and was listing as part in their kind of news, AI news sections, as if they had written this story with like small sort of credit to Fortune. And you can see that happening with all of these companies that are building clearly news products. You can see Google is aiming towards doing a sort of, you ask a question and it gives you the answer before even going to its 10 blue links. So I think this is a moment where we, as the news industry, need to figure out how are we compensated for this, and how do we ensure that there doesn't come a point where nobody needs to come to the homepage of FT.com because they can simply ask Perplexity, based on all the work that we've done. As authors, actually, I feel more optimistic. I feel that from all my study, use, and kind of understanding of the systems, it's a good enough system. It's great for writing emails, or I recently used it to write a description for something I sold on Facebook Marketplace. It saved me loads of time. But if you're looking for insight, analysis, if you're looking to be delighted or amazed or simply to be changed by a piece of writing or journalism, you're not going to find that in an AI-generated chatbot. And so I think that it will things will change, the economics will change, but you're still going to have the human creativity, the best of it, surviving at the other end of this.
I'll be brief. I should declare an interest because I chair a couple of organizations that are dedicated to authors and creators' rights and remuneration, ALCS and the CLA. And I'm also on the Advisory Council of the British Library, so I've got multiple interests at play. And I think, really, to Madhumita's point, we must understand what AI is and isn't. What it isn't is something with a worldview and a life and any direct contact with the world. So when it comes to people speaking from a particular position with a particular voice, sharing stories, fictional or true, sharing experiences of the world, sharing a perspective, we uniquely have the ability to do that. And the important thing is that the presentation, so to speak, doesn't deceive us into a kind of unknowing, where we don't know whether what we're seeing is the unique perspective and voice of someone or just something generated by something. Pragmatically, I think we have to try to imagine a world in which AI is, as ubiquitous as Google search, in which it's there, it's a box, you type, and what that does. And of course, one thing it does is make certain kinds of writing, certain kinds of living, certain kinds of working with words and images and ideas much less easy to sustain as a living. It hollows them out. There's always been this kind of change, but I do think we need to be really, really careful about those skills we want people to possess, those areas of human endeavor we want people to be involved in, not just because people are good and AI is bad, but because it's intrinsically important for the health of a society for people to have these skills, to be involved in this kind of thing. News gathering and reporting is one such thing. It's not value neutral for society to hollow out the ability of news gathering organizations to recruit and remunerate an entire generation of junior journalists. That is not good for a society. So we do get to think about the incentives. I could go on all day, I won't, but I think this balance between pragmatism and idealism is the tightrope that we walk here. And we need to be prepared to be kind of values-led, to talk about what we want and need and deserve, as well as just what can, in theory, be done by a tool.
So I think for me, I wear three hats. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a columnist and an author. And I have to say that as an entrepreneur, it's already eating my pie, so to speak. We use it in our organization for what we consider the dull jobs, which is preparing pitch decks. of course, you need human intervention to fix the stuff and get rid of all the hallucinations that, it'll build in. As a columnist, I'm hoping I'll keep my job. Hopefully, I'm thinking more and hallucinating less. As an author, I think it has entered dangerous territory. I read recently that there was a Japanese author who won a prize for her novel, and she later said that she had used AI, and the jury said, well, that's fine, you get to keep the prize. So it does raise this larger question about machine creativity versus human creativity. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed and explored, and, whole attendant issues of, does the prize go to the machine? Does it go to the person who put in the right prompt? I think those are really big and deep questions. And I'm told we've run out of time. Thank you for being a great audience and for, being absolutely fantastic with your answers. And I've read both the books. They're both absolutely fabulous and wonderful. So do pick up a copy if this is a topic of interest to you.